Cold War, or the Border War, started in 1966 and it ended in 1986. And South Africa was involved. It was, a lot of it took place between Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, and Angola. I was called up as a Marine. I did basic training in Saldanha Bay, and from there I went to Simonstown, where I did Navy basics, as well as Army basics, as well as parabats, divers course.
Yeah, I felt very, very scared. It was very upsetting to know that your young son of 17 has to go off and be in danger all the time.
The quality of training that we got was of very high standard. So we didn't have a lot of technical advances, but the ground and the actual training of the personnel or the people was very, very high, and we all turned out to be relatively good soldiers.
They were called out as soon as they finished school, and sometimes in the case of Ian, he was only 17 when he was called up, coming up for 18, mind you. And we had to take them off to this big place where they all met, and then he was just shipped away and we didn't know where he was going to. And they went off. He actually ended up going to a big training camp where he went for about 6 months of basics, and he would come home at the end of that and his arms would be bleeding from doing leopard crawl, and really it wasn't a very pleasant experience for him.
I was stationed in a place called Ketima Malelo, which was on the southwest African border, in a place called the Caprivi Strip, where there was a lot of insurgents happening. So in other words, there was a lot of people that were coming into South Africa being classed as terrorists, and our job was to actually prevent them and stop them from getting across the border into Southwest Africa. So I was there on the border for 3 months, but other than that I was stationed in Walvis Bay for 7 months, and there we did patrols. A difficult period of this time was actually living in a home environment with your mom and your dad, and then actually being asked to go into a military base where you are basically taken from being an individual into a unit. You know, after a long period of time, I actually realized why they had to do it, because no army can function as an individual. But the breaking down from being individual into a army unit was probably the most trying, because it was a big change in lifestyle.
Eventually, later on, they were posted to the border, where they had to defend against the foreign troops and troops from Namibia. So it was quite scary for them as well. They were all young boys and quite frightened about going to war. And Ian actually was a medic, so he had to patch up the people who were injured, and he was right up on the border of Angola, and he had some horrible experiences of seeing other young men who'd had their legs blown off and things like that. So it was very difficult for them. And then when they came home on leave in between, to come back into normal life was also quite a big change for them, very difficult for them.
Being in the SADF and being trained as a soldier, there were moments where you trained your heart out. You had big, strong men crying. It was really, really tough. but there were also a lot of very light-hearted moments. There were a lot of funny moments, and there were a lot of times when you saw very unusual things. For instance, when I was in South Africa, Namibia, we were doing a patrol in the desert, and we came across a World War II Sherman tank in absolute perfect condition. We took GPS bearings, and we went back there a couple of weeks later, and it was gone. The sand does very strange things in the desert, so we were quite disappointed because we never got to play in the tank.
Adrian went when he was older because he'd done his apprenticeship first, and then he went into intelligence, and he did an officer's course. Although he also was in Angola, right up on the north side of the border, and he used to be with the high-power generals, filming them and filming arms caches and things like that they dug up full of lots of AK-47 rifles, which were Russian rifles. And so that was quite an important thing he was doing at that time.
When I was on the border, actually doing patrols, we were on a little boat that is called a barge. So we were on the barge going down a river called the Chobe River. We used to patrol the Chobe River. And I remember the one day, it was a typical day on the border where you're doing your patrol. It's very, very hot. The temperatures reach between 32 and 35 degrees centigrade, so it's very, very hot. It's very muggy. So we were all sitting on the barge with very little attire on, as you can imagine, when we suddenly realized that the engine was making a really strange noise. Now the engine of this particular barge was a two-stroke engine, so it was making a really chuggy noise. In other words, chug, 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 chug. But suddenly we realized that the pitch and the sound of the motor was actually increasing. So instead of just being a normal two-stroke sound, it was revving up. And we thought, oh my gosh, something is really happening to the engine. So we started to open the engine cover to actually see what was happening. And we actually realized that we were being shot at by somebody on the shore.
We were always worried about our children, and we were always concerned that they would get through it all in one piece. But it certainly was good for some of them. Some of them survived the army well, others were broken down in spirit by the harsh treatment they had, some of them by their commanding officers and their sergeants and all those. And some boys committed suicide because they couldn't handle the treatment they had. So it was not a pleasant experience, and they had to go. There was no choice. If they didn't go, they could go to jail. They would have been sent to jail for 3 years.
The two years in national service did actually two things. The first thing, it took me from being a boy, it made me into a man. It showed me that, you know, life is not easy. So those 2 years helped me put a good grounding for the rest of my life. It made me realize what my capabilities were, and it showed me where my failures were. So there were very few very positive aspects of doing the national service, but there were also very negative aspects.
For me, I think the worst was just knowing your children were being taken away from you and might never come back. I think that was the most frightening experience, just thinking you don't know what's going to happen to them. They could get blown up with a landmine, they could get shot in the the tanks. There were some terrible battles where they were really mowed down. They were bombed with missiles into the tanks, and really many boys were badly injured and mentally scarred through it as well. And funny thing, they don't even want to talk about it today, because I mean that was how long, 20 years ago, longer, probably, I don't even know, yeah, it was about 30 years ago, and many of those guys can't talk about it because of the harsh experiences they had.
Emotionally, it was one of the best roller coaster rides I've ever had, because there were times where you actually found yourself just wanting to totally give up, and that is when the human spirit actually evolves into something very special. You find that you can really bond with people that you don't even know. They become very special, and also you realize that you can actually, as being a man, you can cry, and it's not a bad thing. So the emotionally during that time, it was very interesting, because there were so many highs and so many lows. We had very hard times. We were pushed to beyond the limit of sort of normal average people, but at the end of the day we came out strong, we came out as a unit, and we came out trusting each other. So the answer to your question, did the army make me a hard person? Not necessarily. Did the army make me a wise person? Possibly. Did the army make me a better person?